Before we start talking about asking panel members about their sort of initial opinions on where we are with climate change negotiations and climate change action in South Africa, sort of want to give you a brief international situation. So even though during November, when there's the annual COP conferences, this is when we typically hear in the media of progress. But the reality is that there's actually a very well-defined timeline of these international negotiations. So a very important one in the middle of every year, usually in the beginning of June, is the Bonn Climate Change Conference. And in my view, Bonn is actually where a lot of the real work happens. So early in Bonn, there was a discussion, and it identified a number of points that I think will be relevant to COP28. And we already see that in the brochure that we distributed for today's meeting. Issues of mitigation, climate finance, the global stocktake, loss and damages, adaptation, a just transition, mechanisms to replace the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism, and actually two elements added by our UAE hosts, agriculture and food, and climate change and health. And these are themes that came from the Bonn June 2023 meeting. But there's been several other meetings that then built on those findings. So after Bonn, there was in late June a summit for a new global financing pact in Paris. In mid-July was the 7th ministerial meeting on climate action in Brussels. Early September, there was the Africa Climate Week in Nairobi, Kenya. Just in the second week of September, the G20 summit in New Delhi, India. And of course, it's not just climate change on the agenda, but a number of other issues. Then there was the UN General Assembly in mid-September. Towards the end of September, the New York Climate Week. The 2nd of October was a Climate and Energy Summit in Madrid, Spain. Interesting, last week, 5th of October, was the second pledging conference for the UN's flagship Green Climate Fund, the GCF. It also took place in Bonn. And essentially, this is where members revamp and rethink their commitments to the Green Climate Fund. And here we saw that the US and Australia, together with Italy, Sweden, and Switzerland, said they'll commit funds, but they didn't specify how much. And again, it was noted that neither the US or Australia have failed to pledge anything since 2014. So we can expect this to be a talking point at COP28. This week is the Middle East and North Africa Climate Week in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Next week is the World Bank and International Monetary Fund annual meeting in Marrakesh. At the end of October, Latin American Caribbean Climate Week in Panama City. And then at the end, first 2 weeks in December is COP28 in Dubai in United Arab Emirates. So I hope you get the sense that there's a number of very significant international events where the details of what we usually just see as an outcome of COP28 gets negotiated in some detail beforehand. Let's bring it back to South Africa and Africa. I'm interested from the panel, and it's an open question to the panel, where does climate change feature in the current national and continental discourse? I haven't seen much in the news around COP28 just yet, apart from this news press release, which I was obviously the instigator of, together with our partners. But Steve, if I start with you, where does climate change feature in the current South African and continental discourse?
How long have we got? Obviously, it's not something that you see very front and center, but I think it is something that underpins a lot of what we're thinking about. So obviously the impact of climate change on energy transitions in South Africa and across the continent is a huge thing. And there's a lot of differences of opinion. And so we are in a process now, as everywhere else in the world, about having this debate about what does climate change mean for the pace at which we transition. So you would have seen in the President of South Africa's annual statement, State of the Nation address earlier this year, he very much talked about climate change and the role of climate change, but framed in this way that every country has the sovereign right to decide the pace at which they transition, and the debate we are having is what is the pace that we can afford. And again, huge spectrum. We, the Presidential Climate Commission, ran a series of dialogues at the beginning of this year looking specifically at electricity and energy transitions. And really the debate is sort of bookended by two potential views. We're not going fast enough. Climate change is dire for the economy. If we don't move quickly enough, we'll be exposed to all sorts of trade and what they call transition risks. And on the other end of the spectrum saying, well, this transition is going too fast. We haven't installed the countermeasures we need in places like Mpumalanga where you might lose jobs. And both sides are right. And so how do we find this kind of middle ground and address both sides of the issues is the core challenge, really.
Thank you, Steve. Tanya?
Yes, I think it is working. I think back to, it was 2013 COP in Durban. I think it was 2013 COP. And when I had just taken over the sustainability role in Investec, and I asked if I could please, represent Investec and go to COP 13. No one knew what it was. No one knew. I had to explain what COP stands for, what they do. Even my own family, my friends, no one had heard of COP. And that was already, we were already well into it. I think that has changed significantly in 10 years. So you're saying you haven't seen much. I don't know if I agree with that. Every single day when I open up, my Bloombergs or Daily Maverick are fantastic. I'm seeing it every day. I'm seeing it every week. There's discussions, there's conversations. And, it's a critical point because when the media stop talking about something, you've lost. When the media keep every week raising and highlighting, then you're going to get somewhere. But I concur with Steve's sentiments. So much to do, and talking is one thing, but action is another.
So I'm coming from the business school and a corporate background. And what we see at the business school is not necessarily conversations around COP28. So it's absolutely wonderful to be hosting this event here and being part of this conversation. What we have seen in recent years, building on comments from Tanya, is that on the corporate side, there's a lot of requests for ESG, and ESG strategy. And that's a parallel complementary conversation. And I do think that the climate agenda and the climate debate is part of that. But the question we often get is, what do we do with this ESG stuff? And so the environmental and the climate agenda is definitely part of that. And I've seen a difference in the corporate conversations, even the conversations in my classroom since about 2018. And I don't know why 2018, but that's it wasn't much happening after in 2016 or 2017. And my classes, even in 2018, students were saying, why are we having this conversation about climate change? And then we started to get corporates asking about ESG, so that a large part of that is the climate conversation in a corporate environment, I think, the questions that we're getting from corporates, but also it's the navigating the S. So in Africa, the conversation's about just transition. But even when I was working with my colleagues a year ago on a launch to business schools across Africa about just transition in Africa, I had colleagues from around Africa saying, Joel, what's this just transition? And we had some wonderful conversations and have had over the last year at business schools and talking about where the demands are from the corporate environment, from the students that actually go through our institutions. So I don't think we've got enough change. I think it's at the early days of compliance, of reporting, and to Steve's point, there's we've got to get to the action agenda, which is what this session is all about.
Thanks, Julia. I think the action agenda is actually one of the major points that the President-designate Professor Sultan Al-Jaber has mentioned for COP28. Going online, Thuraya, do you have a different perspective from your part of the world on where climate change and COP28 features in the current discourse?
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to join in the discussions today. And it's a great honor for me to address you all on behalf of the incoming presidency of COP28 and to be a part of the discussion on how we can enhance climate action and support. What I've noticed within the Middle East in general is that there is a very strong will to galvanize action within the context of climate, especially as you see, we are hosting the COP28, and as you are aware, the global stocktake is a major defining moment in this process. And within this spirit, what we aim to do is to inform ambition and action and support, and how those messages can come out of the GST, both in a technical and the political level. So we are very much keen to have an overall message that we can deliver as a collective goal at COP28, and how we can actually transform 1.5 in a manner that is just and driven by the science, so that climate action drives growth and prosperity for all of us.
Thank you very much, Thuraya. Guy, you've got lots of experience in the international domain and what the nuances and the current topics of discussion is. Do you think my assertion that it's not that front and center in South Africa is accurate, or am I missing some murmurings and discussions behind closed doors?
Thanks, Bharat, and thanks very much for inviting me to participate. I do hope my bandwidth holds up. Well, no, I think it is a big topic of discussion, increasingly so in the last few years here in South Africa, and particularly around the just transition. And on that issue, the fair distribution of energy jobs, for example, across the country. What is your baseline? There's an argument that it is unfair for jobs to be lost in parts of the country which are rich in fossil fuels, but isn't it unfair that all the energy jobs are in one part of the country which has the fossil fuels? Shouldn't we be looking at a fairer distribution of energy jobs across the country? So there's some interesting perspectives and lenses that I think we can bring to this debate as a nation. But just, I'm glad Thuraya brought up the science. I just wanted to insert this. We're talking about negotiations. We cannot negotiate with nature, and we can negotiate with each other, but we cannot negotiate with nature. We have an asymmetrical relationship. Nature holds the power, and this is where the science has really helped us, because we know that our carbon budget is probably somewhere around 380 billion tons CO2. And that at current rates of emission, it gives us 9 years to get on top of this problem with a 50-50 chance of staying below 1.5 degrees. The science has given us a very clear set of goals, or not goals, but indicated what needs to be done in order to avoid risks, which are very much risks to Africa. We know Africa is the continent that stands foremost in the pathway of adverse climate effects. And if we look at the continental view, which came out in September, strong emphasis on decarbonization of the global economy, which you can understand from the perspective of Africa's risk profile, and then a link with debt restructuring, which I think is also is an important and nuanced view to take. So if Africa can climb out of its debt problems through creative and powerful just energy transition, which doesn't damage the environment, improves people's health, adds to food security, and all those other things, then we're ahead of the game. If we don't, we're going to face significant problems on this continent and in this country.